It is a tremendous pleasure to be back here with all of you again and have the opportunity to talk about failure. Something that we all learn from. Hopefully we all progress having done so. And so I thought I would share with you some of my journey and some of the things I learned along the way. My last day at the Smithsonian was absolutely a low point, both professionally and personally. I had been there for a number of years. I had mastered the operation of the world's largest museum complex. I had led the planning of the American Indian Museum, the planning for the renovation of the Portrait Gallery in American Art, the construction of the new Air and Space Museum, and the beginning of the planning for the African American Museum of History and Culture. But on that day, essentially, I left with my head hanging, feeling that I, in fact, had failed the institution for which I had enormous respect. I loved my job on the castle, had huge respect for the institution, but I had failed. I had failed to stand up and essentially raise issues and concerns about issues that were challenging the institution. I had failed to essentially challenge individuals within the institution about the decisions they had made. So as I left, I waited for all of my colleagues in the castle to leave because I was embarrassed. I, in fact, had failed them, and I had failed on the lessons that I had learned in my career before then. So as I left, I thought about what essentially I had done wrong. I thought about all those lessons that I could have drawn on. So I thought I might go back to those lessons and share with you some of the thoughts that I had that day and what I determined, in fact, I might have done differently. We all remember our first charge nurse. I certainly do. Her name was Diane Cooper, and she was at Alta Bates Hospital in Berkeley, California, which is the first place I worked. She had an iron fist, but it was in a velvet glove. Some of you may be old enough to remember Reality Shock and Marilyn Kramer's review of what the institutions did to new graduates as they came into practice. I was one of those new graduates in shock, essentially trying to navigate that new opportunity. Diane, in fact, served for my purposes as the perfect mentor. We weren't punished for making mistakes. We were led to learn from our mistakes and essentially carry those lessons going forward. When I went to New York City to work for the Student Nurses Association, I had Mary Ann Tuft, who was then the executive director of NSNA, and Thelma Shore, who was the head of the AJN, both of whom served as mentors to this young California kid who essentially had no idea of how to manage both living in a city like New York, but also managing in an institution and managing to essentially deal with teams, to deal with students in this context. They were both remarkable. They were outspoken, they were strong managers, they were team builders, and they chose to be mentors. But nothing, in fact, prepared me for my next move to the Senate. There were no gentle leaders. There were no mentors that were identified, and more often than not, I was the only woman in the room. Essentially, the key to success in this context was to identify someone as a mentor, to seek support, frankly, largely from other women who were present at the time. Mary Wakefield was, in fact, a student of this issue and this institution as another staff person, and helped me understand how to manage in a boys' club. Not all of the mentors that I chose were, in fact, health experts. In fact, many of them were tax experts or Social Security experts or trade experts, but all of them knew how to manage the process. All of them knew how to guide this new staff person to understand the institution and to understand the challenges that were ahead and how best to navigate. Now, you had to believe in yourself, which took some time. You had to take risks, absolutely. But it got to the point where someone literally gave me a box of nails to put on my desk and saying, "You've become as tough as nails." But it was a very tough transition. So finding the mentor was, in fact, the success story for me in all of those instances, whether it was at Alta Bates, whether it was at NSNA, whether it was in the Senate. All of those times I identified and found someone who was willing to stand up and someone who was willing to essentially guide me going forward. My time at Harvard was no different. It was a different kind of club, absolutely. Not a lot of attention to team. Everybody was sort of on their own. But as executive dean, I needed partners. And so I looked to my colleagues in the institution to help me navigate a new environment, in this case, Harvard University. At the Smithsonian, there were a lot of teams, but essentially a lot of competing demands, whether it was from the zoo or our astrophysics department or the research in Panama or the renovation and restoration of the Star-Spangled Banner. Each of them presented a different set of challenges. Each of them called on me to manage people and manage circumstances that I, in fact, had failed to understand going in, but quickly learned that I needed to depend on other people to essentially assist me in doing that. In all of those cases, I needed someone to guide me. Imagine all of you have had a similar kind of experience walking into a new environment, or even in the environment in which you're presently practicing, essentially being confronted with a new challenge, and finding someone, finding a mentor who in fact can help you understand and learn from that process. So that was my first lesson. The other thing I realized in the course of that was the importance of becoming one, and that someone else had reached down and lent a hand to me, that part of my responsibility was to do the same thing. That is to reach down, and whether it was to a student, whether it was to a colleague, whether it was to someone with whom I had another relationship, offer to be that mentor. Offer to essentially step up and help guide them through the kind of challenges that you've been through. You will find that the reward for doing that is absolutely immense, and something that will come back and reward you time and time again. I'm sure all of you have had students that you've dealt with in years past, or others with whom you've had relationships who will come back to you at some point and tell you the difference that made in terms of their lives and their progress. So look for the opportunity to mentor and look for the opportunity to guide. Fall back on what you've experienced and play it forward. The second lesson that I learned, painfully, was to ask for help. Essentially, knowing when to ask for help and what kind of help becomes critical. I was the Deputy Secretary and Chief Operating Officer of the Smithsonian. We were in the midst of the renovation of the building that houses the Portrait Gallery in the American Art Museum. We essentially had cranes in place. The construction had begun. We had already spent millions of dollars. I was called on to go before the DC Arts Commission and explain what we had in mind, explain essentially the construction and what our goal was in terms of renovating that old, wonderful building. I did so, and I failed. They said no. So $10 million later in the cost of steel, after visiting every single one of the commission members personally, one by one, but in this case accompanied by an architect who'd actually designed the building and could explain what our vision was, we finally succeeded. But it was a painful and a very expensive lesson. So whether the players are different or the circumstances or roles change, the lesson remained the same. That is, I was not always the smartest person in the room. And I was also not always the right person to essentially send the message, whether it was at Alta Bates, whether it was at NSNA, whether it was at Harvard, whether it was on the Hill. Secondly, finding someone who can assist you in reaching down and asking for that help when you know that you need it. Having people in your corner is one thing. Knowing when to ask for help is an entirely different situation. and an enormously important one in terms of succeeding in what you're hoping to do. And it's a magic place. If you've not had a chance to look at the Reynolds Building and that remarkable courtyard, you ought to do it while you're here. The third lesson, which was probably the hardest for me, was to learn to listen. Even when it's hard, even when it's not something that you want to hear. In this case, I walked into my office in the Capitol and I was angry. I had been the subject of literally weeks of press, essentially suggesting that I was leading my boss, Senator Dole, astray, that I was essentially taking him left of center and leading him to the dark side. I was known as Hillary Light. And it was day after, not a bad thing, but nonetheless, it was a bad thing to some people. But essentially, these were the kinds of stories. This was a Sunday New York Times cover story in the magazine. I was meeting that day with a group of conservatives in my office, and the topic was welfare reform. So you can imagine how this conversation went. The issue at stake was the definition of the foundation of society. These are the heavy thoughts that we had in the Senate as we were negotiating welfare reform. Now, they had a point of view that the foundation of society, what mattered, was the traditional family, the husband, the wife, the kids. Well, I was a product of 16 years of Catholic education before I went to graduate school. And I felt compelled to argue that nuns were part of the foundation of society. Who knew? Who knew? I also had the Jesuits, which was a whole different story. But nonetheless, I made that argument. And in fact, we both went away angry, not having resolved the question, not having come to an agreement, not having found a resolution. I failed my boss. I failed to take the opportunity to come to common agreement. I failed to take the opportunity to understand what it is they were trying to achieve. Now, there are instances where there are absolutes, where you can go one way or the other. But in most instances in my career, in fact, there is a middle that can be found, where everybody walks away having felt like they had achieved something. And that day, I absolutely failed. So essentially, in conclusion, these were my lessons. Finding a mentor, finding somebody who could guide me, someone who would give me clues about how to navigate a new environment. Seeking help, even when essentially I was sure that I could manage it on my own. Recognizing I wasn't the smartest person in the room and the only one who could manage. Learning to listen, even to the opposition, and finding an accommodation. The other lesson that I learned was the management of personal and professional responsibilities. Essentially, throughout my career, the need to be able to find that balance was important to me. There were lots of nights. I had all three of my kids when I was Dole's chief of staff. Nights when I went home, put my kids to bed, and went back to work. There were nights when I had to explain stories like the one I showed you the picture of to my kids, who couldn't understand why mom was in the paper with horns on her head. And essentially explain, these were not my enemies. These were not people that meant me harm, but they were a difference of opinion that had to be navigated. And that was an important part of what they had to learn to do, was to find essentially accommodation and essentially find the way to resolve those differences. And then finally, I think the most important thing for us today is that I also learned to stand tall. There were times when, in fact, you feel defeated. There were times when, I had, in fact, failed, certainly the examples that I just gave you. But essentially, how to work in teams. It's amazing what nursing has prepared us to do and the skills that we acquire. Teams is one of them. The ability to set priorities, the ability to listen, whether it's to your patient or to their families or to other colleagues with whom you're working. The ability and willingness to take risks, to stand up. Every nurse is prepared to stand tall, as well as we don't allow others to define us or to define what we do. So as I looked back at my experience at the Smithsonian, that's where I had failed. I had failed to take risks. I had failed to stand up. I had failed in this case to ask for help from others around me in terms of making the decisions. But it's a lesson that I learned, as painful as it was, and it's a lesson that I will carry with me. Thank you.